The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a nest of angry wasps. Laura Bennett moved through the ICU with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory so deeply grooved it no longer felt like thinking, it was just breathing, just existing in this space where the monitors beeped their mechanical lullabies and the ventilators wheezed their pneumatic rhythms. Room for 12. Dopamine running at 5 micrograms per kilogram per minute. She checked the drip rate, steady, and her fingers lingered on the fall line for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. Just a nurse. That's what they all thought. That's what she'd trained herself to be. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hung in the air like a permanent fog. It was 02 for 7 hours. 3 hours into her night shift, and the ward had settled into that peculiar silence that only existed when most of the city slept. The ICU never truly quieted. There was always the percussion of machines, the hiss of compressed oxygen, the occasional page crackling overhead, but at this hour, the chaos compressed into a kind of rhythm. 3 patients stable. 2 on the edge. 1 she was watching closely. The rhythms of mortality and recovery playing themselves out in real time. She moved between rooms like water finding channels. Room for 08, a post-op cardiac patient whose blood pressure had been drifting down since 2300 hours. Not enough to trigger alarms yet. Not enough to call the resident. But enough that Laura had adjusted his sodium bicarbonate infusion 17 minutes ago, had repositioned him off his left side, had slowed his fluid replacement by 10 milliliters per hour. The kind of small interventions that existed in the space between protocols and intuition. The kind of thinking that would have gotten her a medical degree if she'd had a different life. She touched the inside of her jacket lining, feeling for the patch through the fabric. Faded now, almost threadbare. The unit insignia worn soft from years of being pressed against the leather, hidden from the world. Special forces had a way of becoming a part of your skin after enough time. After Afghanistan. After Marjah. The IED had detonated on a Tuesday. Or maybe a Wednesday. Time had become strange in that first month, after the medevac, after the surgeries, after the doctors in Germany had explained in careful voices what spinal fusion meant and what the permanent nerve damage meant and what it meant that she would never again do the one thing she'd trained 18 months to be prepared to do. Staff Sergeant Laura Bennett, discharged medically, sent home with a spine held together by titanium and a purple heart folded into a shadow box. Sent home to figure out what to do when your entire identity had been built on a body that no longer worked the way it was designed to. Nursing had been the answer. Or maybe just the placeholder for an answer. The work required the kind of precision she had, the attention to detail, the ability to predict deterioration, the instinct for reading a patient's trajectory before the monitors caught up. It also required her to be invisible. To defer. To smile and nod and accept the hierarchy that had been established long before she walked into Sacred Heart as a 34-year-old woman with a medical discharge and a story she would never tell. Room for 12 again. Vital stable. She made a note on the chart, her handwriting tight and clinical, and moved on. The hallway stretched before her, fluorescent and endless. The patient in 413 had been asking for pain medication for the past 4 hours. Laura had flagged it twice on the call bell. The resident had said give it another hour, see if it settles. The resident was 26 and fresh out of medical school and had no idea what post-operative pain looked like when it was about to become something worse. But Laura didn't argue. She had learned not to argue. That had changed 17 hours ago, during grand rounds. Dr. Mercer had been presenting a case of septic shock, explaining the treatment protocol to a room full of 30 residents and fellows and medical students, and his dosage calculation had been wrong. Not slightly wrong. Dangerously wrong. A microgram discrepancy that would have tanked the patient's blood pressure into organ failure territory. Laura had been standing in the back of the room, ostensibly there to provide patient context. Instead, she had quietly corrected him. Just whispered it. That's 0.8 micrograms per kilogram, doctor. Quiet enough that only 3 people heard it. Quiet enough that it shouldn't have mattered. It had mattered to Dr. Mercer. She could see it in the way his jaw had tightened. The way his eyes had moved to her for exactly 1 second. then past her, as if she had already stopped existing. He had continued the presentation with the corrected dosage, no acknowledgement, no thank you, and Laura had stood there with her hand steady and her face empty and had learned once again the precise cost of being right when you were supposed to be invisible. The patch inside her jacket lining had cost her more than that. 18 years of her life. Her spine. Her career. Her right to ever be the one making the decisions. The patch meant staff sergeant, which meant leadership, which meant being the kind of person who didn't ask permission or wait for approval or stand quietly while men younger and less experienced than her made life or death calculations in the wrong direction. But that person was gone. She had killed her at the moment the medevac chopper lifted off from Marjah, and she had sworn to keep her dead. She gripped the sink in the supply closet at 03 for 7 hours, her knuckles whitening under the pressure. The room was barely more than a closet, really, stacks of gloves and gauze pads and sterile saline bags reaching toward the ceiling in careful towers. Her reflection stared back at her from the small mirror mounted above the sink, and for just a moment, she let the composure slip. The jaw clenched. The breathing came a little sharper. The reflection looked like someone who had been holding something in for so long that the weight of it was becoming visible. She released the sink. Turned off the light. Stepped back into the hallway where the machines were still beeping and the lights were still humming and there was still work to be done. The shift briefing came at 0600 hours, 10 minutes before the day's shift arrived to take over. Laura sat at the nurses' station with the other night shift nurses, going through the handoff reports. 3 stable ICU patients. 2 med-surg floors clear. No new admissions. Routine night. Nothing unusual. Then the charge nurse turned to Laura. We've got an inbound. Colonel James Vickers, inbound from Colorado Springs Memorial ER transfer. Cardiac history, hypertension, admitted for observation after a work-related incident. ETA 45 minutes. He specifically requested you as his nurse. The words fell into the room like a dropped instrument tray. Loud. Obvious. Impossible to take back. Laura's hands remained steady. Her face remained flat. But somewhere inside her chest, something shifted. Colonel Vickers. She knew exactly who Colonel Vickers was. She had met him twice, once at a command ceremony in 2019, and once at her son's commissioning ceremony in 2023, where he had stood in his full-dress blues and shaken her hand with the kind of grip that meant he understood exactly what a military family was. He was the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, Colorado Springs. He was the man who would decide, in the next 18 months, when Marcus turned 20, whether her 19-year-old son was deployed to Helmand Province or kept stateside. He was the man who would decide whether Marcus followed his mother's footsteps into the worst places on earth. She had never told Marcus about the patch. Had never told him about Marjah, about the IED, about what it meant to have pieces of shrapnel in places where they would never come out. Had told him instead that she'd had a career, that it hadn't worked out, that she loved nursing. Simple. Clean. Complete. The kind of story a child could accept without understanding that his mother had spent 19 years learning to walk again, physically and psychologically, so that he would never have to. The briefing continued. Laura took notes. Cardiac history. Work-related incident. Monitor closely. The shift change happened at 0700 hours, and Laura handed off her 3 stable patients to the day's shift nurses with the same precision and efficiency she always did. Everything documented. Everything explained. Everything exact. No one would ever know that her hands were shaking, but they weren't. That was the thing about muscle memory. About training. About having learned to compartmentalize trauma into small boxes and stack them in the back of your mind like the supplies on the shelves around you. She changed out of her scrubs at 0730 hours. Pulled her jacket on, buttoning it carefully. Felt the patch inside the lining. Just a talisman. Just a ghost. Just a reminder of someone she had been in a different life, in a different country, in a different version of herself that had believed she would spend her entire career leading Marines through the deadliest corridors of Afghanistan. The next voice she heard wasn't from the ward. It was from the charge nurse, calling her name down the hallway. "Bennett. You're staying over. Mercer wants you in charge of the new admit." The new admit sat in room 347, and Mercer wanted Laura in charge of the setup, which meant she'd be the one documenting everything he did, the perfect position for him to make an example of her. She didn't know it yet as she pulled the vital signs monitor toward the bed, her movements precise, economical, the kind of muscle memory that came from doing this 5,000 times. Her scrubs were wrinkled from a 12-hour shift, dark circles under her eyes, but her hands were steady as she threaded the blood pressure cuff around the patient's arm. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sickly blue-white glow that made her skin look like old paper. Mercer arrived at Grand Rounds at 8 a.m. sharp, 30 residents trailing behind him like disciples. Laura stood at the back of Conference Room B with her laptop open, her charting already queued up. She documented the previous patient's vitals with her usual precision: blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, all correct, all on time. She knew it was correct before Mercer opened his mouth. The problem was that she'd also quietly corrected a dosage order yesterday. Mercer had written 500 milligrams when the chart called for 50 milligrams of a cardiac glycoside. A tenfold error. She'd verified it twice, then changed it without flagging it formally, just a quiet fix to keep a patient alive. She should have written it up. She'd wanted to. But filing a report meant confrontation, and confrontation meant attention, and attention was the one thing she could never afford. Mercer's voice cut through the room like a scalpel finding a nerve. "Let's examine Ms. Bennett's documentation. Exemplary formatting, certainly. But notice here," he clicked to her notes on the screen. "A nurse who decides to edit physician orders without consultation. Without authorization. Without understanding the clinical context." He looked at the residents, his smile thin as a blade. This is what happens when people forget their scope of practice. When they begin to believe they're physicians instead of order takers. He let that last phrase hang in the air, each word a small stone dropping into still water. The room went quiet. Someone coughed. A resident in the third row glanced at Laura, then away quickly, as if her presence had become suddenly contagious. Laura's jaw tightened. A single muscle, barely visible, contracting just enough that anyone paying close attention would notice. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers relaxed. She looked at the screen where her charting was being dissected, her name emblazoned beneath each entry, and she felt nothing move in her face. No heat in her cheeks. No tremor in her throat. She'd learned to compartmentalize in Kandahar, in convoy routes through the Helmand province, in moments when showing fear meant the entire unit died. This was a hospital. This was paperwork. She could do this. The residents filed out, and Mercer lingered, watching her. Waiting for something, a reaction, a tear, some crack in the facade. She began closing out the charting system instead, each keystroke deliberate, methodical, the sound of her fingers on the keyboard like a metronome in the emptying room. He left finally, unsatisfied. 2 hours later, Laura was restocking supplies near the vending machine on the ICU corridor, methodically checking inventory against the replacement list. Mercer emerged from the physician's lounge with a Diet Coke and positioned himself directly in front of the machines, clearly aware that Laura would need to move. He opened his can, took a long drink, and then spoke to someone who wasn't there, or rather, to the empty corridor in a voice loud enough to carry. Some nurses forget they are not physicians. He said it quietly, almost conversationally, the words landing exactly where he intended. They see a patient, think they understand the situation better than the actual doctor, make little unilateral decisions. Never works out well. He turned slightly, just enough so his peripheral vision could catch her reaction. Laura didn't flinch. She didn't pause. She simply noted the inventory, 2 boxes of 18-gauge angiocath needles, 4 boxes of 10 cubic centimeters syringes, 1 box of chest tube trays, and moved methodically toward the supply cabinet. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She had executed this composure in far worse circumstances, in a Humvee with rounds penetrating the armor, with blood on her uniform, with the radio screaming coordinates for medevac birds that might not arrive in time. She opened the cabinet and began placing supplies in their designated slots. Mercer watched for another 5 seconds, then left. The vending machine hummed its plastic song. Down the hall, an infant cried from a nearby room. The sounds of Sacred Heart at mid-morning, mundane, institutional, utterly unaware that she was standing there with her knuckles pressed white against a cardboard box of supplies, the only place her rage was allowed to exist. By afternoon, the situation escalated. Mr. Jansen in room 352 had been complaining of pain, 7 out of 10 on the scale, his incision from yesterday's appendectomy red and tight beneath the surgical dressing. Laura noticed him wincing when he shifted, noticed the way his breathing changed, shallow and guarded. She reviewed his chart. Mercer had written an order for acetaminophen every 4 hours. Appropriate for minor discomfort. Inadequate for this level of trauma. She consulted the post-op protocol. Patients at 24 hours post-surgical should be on scheduled opioids, not as needed over-the-counter medication. She went to find Mercer at his desk in the physician's section, a small enclosed area where doctors read journals and fielded consultations, a space nurses knocked before entering. She knocked. He looked up, and before she could speak, she already knew what she was walking into. His expression had shifted from professional to predatory in the span of a heartbeat. "Mr. Jansen needs stronger pain management," Laura said quietly. "His incision shows signs of inflammation. Acetaminophen isn't adequate for post-op day 1. The protocol is whatever I write," Mercer said. His voice wasn't raised. That was the dangerous part. "And I'm the one deciding adequacy here, not you. Pain management affects healing outcomes," Laura continued, her tone measured, professional, the voice of a floor nurse making a clinical observation. The voice she was supposed to use, deferential, informative, non-threatening. "Studies show that undertreated postoperative pain increases infection risk by..." "Are you finished?" He leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanging. "Because if you continue this conversation, I'll need to call security to document your persistent insubordination. I have the right to remove staff who challenge my clinical decisions in front of patients and their families. Are we clear?" The threat was real. She'd seen it happen before. A nurse questioned a doctor's call, and suddenly there was an incident report, and suddenly that nurse was being escorted out by security in front of their colleagues and their patients. The institutional machinery was faster than any single person, and it crushed anyone who tried to stand in front of it. She had a son. A medical discharge that had left her with chronic back pain and nightmares. She had rebuilt herself one shift at a time, one paycheck at a time, one day of normalcy at a time. She didn't have the luxury of courage. "Clear," she said. Her voice came out steady. A triumph of discipline over everything else screaming inside her chest. She returned to room 352 and documented the conversation in the chart, exactly as it had occurred, word for word. Then she continued her shift with the same competence, the same precision, the same invisible excellence that made her indispensable and hated in equal measure. No one thanked her. No one had asked her to make that recommendation. She was simply a nurse doing her job, which meant absorbing blows that weren't hers to absorb and smiling while the institution decided your value. That night, at 11:47 p.m., when her shift ended and the unit had settled into the quieter rhythms of second shift, Laura went into the supply closet on the west corridor. It was small, barely 6 feet by 8, lined with boxes of gloves and dressings and saline solutions, the walls cream-colored and windowless. She locked the door, which was against policy but no one ever checked. She approached the sink and gripped its edge, her fingers curling around the cold stainless steel, her knuckles pressing until the flesh went white, then pale, then translucent. The muscles in her forearms trembled, not from sadness, but from pure restrained fury, the kind that took real effort to contain. She stood there for 2 minutes. Maybe 3. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was restraint. It was the difference between staying employed and exploding, between keeping her job and losing everything. She released the sink slowly, flexed her hands, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the basin. Her eyes were cold. Empty. The eyes of someone who had already survived the worst that could happen and knew exactly how much worse it could get. The eyes of someone who had held dying soldiers in a desert 5,000 miles away and understood that pain was information, that rage was data, that emotion was a luxury reserved for people who had nothing left to lose. But that wasn't the worst part. The monitor erupted at 0200 hours. Not the standard rhythm alarm. This was the sound of a heart that had stopped singing. The oscilloscope displayed a flat line wrapped in jagged electrical noise, and beneath that chaos was something worse, muffled heart sounds, as if Vickers's pulse was drowning in its own fluid. Cardiac tamponade. The blood pooling around his heart was suffocating it with every beat, pressure building like a fist clenching tighter and tighter until the fist would crush the organ entirely. Laura was at the bedside before the second alarm activated. 30 seconds for the on-call cardiologist to arrive? No. 20 minutes. Maybe 25 if he was still awake. The distance between now and his arrival felt like an ocean. "Get me a crash cart," she said. Her voice had changed. It had dropped an octave, lost the softness she wore like a borrowed coat. The nurses who'd heard her speak only in hospital whispers for 2 years looked up, startled. And a 14-gauge needle. Now. The ICU was a storm of panic. 3 other patients coding down the hall, monitors wailing in discordant harmony, feet running on tile floors that screamed with every step. A resident stood frozen beside Vickers's bed, staring at the monitor as if his gaze alone could will the heartbeat back into existence. Chest compressions were beginning in the next room. Voices overlapped. The fluorescent panels buzzed like they were conducting electricity directly into everyone's nervous systems. Vickers's skin had gone the color of wet concrete. His lips darkened. Peripheral shut down. His body was closing ranks, pulling blood inward to protect the vital organs, but there was nowhere for the blood to go because his pericardial sac was already full. Laura was moving before she finished her thought. This wasn't the hospital anymore. This was the field. This was Marjah in 2011, and her hands remembered every second of it. The flashback hit like a punch. She was 28 years old and wearing fatigue soaked through with sweat and dust. Operator Reeves was face down in a ditch outside an adobe compound, his chest making that wet, drowning sound, the sound of a pneumothorax collapsing his lung. Rounds were still snapping overhead, she could still hear them, could still feel the percussion of their impacts on the concrete 3 meters away. Her squad leader, Sergeant Clay, was returning fire, giving her maybe 90 seconds before the position became untenable. Her hands were steady then too. Pain was information. Fear was data. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and the hiss of air escaping was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. She was back in the present. The needle was in her hand. She didn't remember retrieving it. Muscle memory was a cruel and perfect thing. "Step back," she said to the resident. Not a request. A command. The tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The resident actually did step back, moving away from the bedside without protest, his face registering confusion but his training deeper than his confidence. Laura's hands moved on their own. She prepped the xiphoid process with an antiseptic swab, the sharp smell of betadine cutting through the stale hospital air. Her fingers found the anatomical landmarks with the kind of precision that came from holding lives together in conditions far worse than this sterile, climate-controlled room. The needle was 18 gauge, 3.5 inches, and it slid beneath the xiphoid process with almost no resistance. "Vitals," she said. "BP dropping," a nurse answered. 50/30. Heart rate 142. The needle advanced. Laura's jaw was locked tight, but not from fear. From the particular focus that came when everything else in the world fell away and there was only the patient and the problem and the solution. The needle angled slightly cranial, threading past ribs and tissue and into the pericardial sac where 80 milliliters of blood had accumulated like a siege weapon against Vickers's heart. The needle pulled back. Dark blood filled the chamber. Not the bright arterial red of a misplaced needle in a heart chamber itself. This was darker, older. Pericardial blood. The blood that had been killing him slowly for the last 4 minutes. Withdrawing fluid, she said. The words came without thought because she'd said them 1,000 times, except last time she'd said them the sky was the color of rust and the temperature was 118 degrees and Reeves was screaming her name. The syringe filled. Laura's hands were absolutely steady. The chamber showed 10 milliliters, then 20, then 40. She could feel Vickers's pulse beneath her other hand, where she was monitoring the carotid, and she felt it strengthen almost imperceptibly as the pressure decreased. O2 sat, she asked. 68 and falling, the nurse said. The needle continued its slow withdrawal. 60 milliliters. 70. The resistance decreased as the pericardial pressure normalized, as Vickers's heart found room to beat again. 80 milliliters. She withdrew the needle. The syringe was warm and dark and full of the thing that would have killed him in minutes. 2 minutes at this rate. Maybe less. O2 sat now, she said. 75. Another breath. The monitor beeped. Once. Then again, and again, settling into a rhythm. 82. The resident was staring at her as though seeing her for the first time. The nurses had stopped moving and were watching her hands with the intensity of people witnessing something they couldn't quite categorize. A crash cart remained unused beside the bed. The phone they'd been reaching for to call the cardiologist hung in a nurse's grip, forgotten. 88, the nurse whispered. Laura stepped back from the bed. Her gloved hands were absolutely still. Her heart rate hadn't elevated above its baseline. She'd just performed emergency open pericardiocentesis without sterile field, without consent, without any authorization beyond the primal authority that comes from holding a life in your hands and refusing to let it slip away. 92, stable. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a heartbeat in it. Not Vickers's heartbeat, that was no longer being stolen by blood, but something else. The silence of people realizing they'd just watched someone operate with a precision and calm that belonged to a different world entirely. Dr. Mercer arrived 8 minutes later, his footsteps loud on the tile, his voice already forming the question before he saw the patient. What's the? He stopped. His eyes moved from Vickers, who was now stable and breathing easily, to Laura, who had stepped back to the medication cart and was documenting her findings as if she'd simply checked the 4-rate. What happened here? Cardiac tamponade, Laura said. Her voice had returned to its normal register, soft and deferential. The mask was back in place. 80 milliliters of pericardial blood. Patient's vitals have stabilized. O2 sat 92 and climbing. Dr. Mercer's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, then understanding, then something darker. His eyes found the needle, the syringe, the documentation forming on the electronic chart. Who performed this procedure? Laura didn't answer. She didn't need to. The chart was updating in real time. Her badge was on her pocket. The answer was obvious to everyone in the room, which made it worse for him. Which made it all worse. Policy 7.3.2, Dr. Mercer said quietly. Scope of practice limitations. You performed a procedure outside your licensure. Laura turned to face him. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds before she returned her attention to Vickers's monitor. Patient is stable. That was the priority. No, Dr. Mercer said, his voice tightening. The priority was following protocol. The priority was waiting for appropriate physician oversight. That's the priority, Ms. Bennett, and the fact that your procedural gamble happened to succeed doesn't change that you violated hospital code. He was already moving toward the phone. Laura could see it in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw. He was going to make this cost her something. He was going to make this exact moment, this moment when she'd just saved a life, when she'd proven something she wasn't supposed to prove, cost her everything. The thing nobody in that ICU understood, the thing they couldn't have known, was that she'd done this before. She'd faced down worse than paperwork, worse than professional consequences, worse than a man in a white coat who understood institutional power the way she understood breathing. And she'd done it with her bare hands in a place where there was no hospital, no policy, no appeal. Just the choice: let someone die because the rules said you couldn't save them, or save them anyway and deal with what came after. Laura had always been very good at dealing with what came after. Dr. Mercer moved with bureaucratic precision, the kind of methodical patience that came from years of weaponizing paperwork against anyone who threatened his carefully constructed empire. Within 48 hours of finding Laura's unauthorized procedure, he had assembled a documentation trail so comprehensive it looked like she'd been a problem for months instead of minutes. Policy 7.3.2 on scope of practice violations. A formal complaint to the Colorado Board of Nursing alleging practice of medicine without a license. And then, the kill shot, an invocation of the rarely used Joint Commission standard that required immediate termination for pattern of insubordination, supported by his meticulously maintained performance review files, each one a small stone in a wall he'd been building since the moment she corrected his dosage error in front of 30 residents. He had no idea what she actually was. That was his advantage and his blindness all at once. The nurse's station was crowded at 0730 when he arrived with the termination letter in his hand, timing it precisely for maximum audience. Laura was charting at the computer, her posture perfect, her hands moving with a kind of steady precision that made competent people look effortless. She didn't flinch when his shadow fell across the desk. Didn't look up. Just kept typing, finishing the sentence about Colonel Vickers's stable vitals, his cardiac output improving, the 80 milliliters of blood she'd withdrawn buying him a second life whether Dr. Mercer wanted to acknowledge it or not. Ms. Bennett. His voice carried. Deliberately. My office. Now. She logged out. Stood. Followed him down the corridor with a kind of calm that made lesser men nervous, though Mercer interpreted it as resignation. The door closed behind them and he handed her the envelope without ceremony, watching for the crack in her facade, the tremor in her hands, the moment she'd finally understand what happened when you challenged someone like him. "You're a liability this hospital cannot afford," he said, his voice loud enough to carry through the thin walls, loud enough that the nurses at the station would hear it, would spread it like spores. "Your actions yesterday constitute a pattern of reckless disregard for chain of command and established protocols. The Board of Nursing will be receiving a formal complaint. You're terminated, effective immediately. You'll return your badge and clear your locker before leaving the building. Security will be informed." Laura opened the envelope. "Read the letter." The legal language was immaculate, references to Policy 7.3.2, subsection B, paragraph 3. Documentation of her repeated insubordination. A summary of the incident report he'd filed, describing her pericardiocentesis as unauthorized medical intervention by non-physician personnel, carefully omitting the part where she'd saved Colonel Vickers's life when the on-call cardiologist was 20 minutes away from arrival and the patient was 20 seconds away from cardiac arrest. She folded the letter. Slipped it back into the envelope. Her jaw had tightened, just barely, just enough that someone who'd been looking for it would see it, but when she met his eyes, there was nothing there. No anger. No fear. No emotion that could be weaponized or celebrated. Just the flat, neutral stare of someone who had absorbed worse than this and kept moving anyway. "Understood," she said quietly. That was all. No protest. No defense. No begging or bargaining or emotional breakdown. Just acceptance, delivered in a voice that made Mercer's hands clench because he'd been expecting drama and gotten nothing but compliance, which somehow felt like rejection anyway. She walked out of his office and didn't look back. The nurse's station went silent as she passed, every eye tracking her to her locker, watching as she removed her badge lanyard and set it on the desk with a soft clink, watching as she emptied the contents of her locker into a cardboard box with methodical efficiency. The cracked mug reading "World's Okayest Nurse" that Marcus had given her 2 years ago. The half-dead succulent someone had left in the break room that she'd been keeping on the windowsill, watering it out of stubborn habit even though it was clearly dying. A photograph in a cheap plastic frame, her holding Marcus at his high school graduation, both of them smiling, his arm around her shoulder, her arm around his waist, the kind of moment where you look at your child and think about how you managed to give him anything good despite the shattered spine, despite the medical discharge, despite the fact that you were supposed to be his hero and instead you were just trying to hold it together one day at a time. She carried the box to the elevator. The doors closed on her reflection in the polished steel, the dark circles under her eyes, the hair pulled back in a tight bun, the scrubs that would never fit her the same way again because everything had changed in the span of a termination letter. The lobby was empty. The rain outside sounded like gunfire on the glass doors. An hour later, she was sitting on a metal bench at a bus stop on Colorado Avenue, the cardboard box beside her, the rain falling in sheets that hammered the pavement like applause for something she'd done right. The kind of rain that made the whole world feel like it was underwater, pressing down from above, soaking through the thin fabric of her jacket, running down her face in rivulets that mixed with salt she wouldn't admit were tears because soldiers don't cry. Their eyes just burn sometimes from the rain and the wind and the knowledge that everything you built with your hands can be taken away by someone who's never built anything at all. She'd called 3 hospitals. All of them had already received calls from the Colorado Board of Nursing, preliminary inquiries about her qualifications, her judgment, her fitness to practice. The letters would follow within days. Hospitals didn't hire nurses under board investigation. That was how this worked. Mercer had understood that before he'd even filed the paperwork. He'd built this wall brick by brick and Laura had watched it go up without making a single sound. The photo slipped from the box. She caught it before it hit the wet asphalt, her reflexes faster than thought, muscle memory from another life. Marcus at 17, smiling like the world hadn't shattered yet, like his mother wasn't about to lose the only stable thing she'd managed to construct since her medical discharge. She stared at it, water streaming down the plastic frame, and thought about the conversation she'd have to have, the explanation she'd have to give, the way his face would fall when he realized that his commanding officer, the man who'd been teaching him the same things she'd been teaching him, the discipline and the precision and the refusal to quit, was the reason his mother was sitting at a bus stop in the rain with a cardboard box and maybe $50 left in her checking account. She almost threw the photograph away. Opened her hand. Watched the rain fall through her fingers. The bus was coming in the distance, headlights blurred by the downpour, and she could just let it go, let the water take it, let the pavement dissolve it into nothing, stop pretending that she could hold on to both her past and her future at the same time. But then her hand closed. The photograph stayed. Because the unit patch was still there, sewn inside her jacket lining where no one could see it, where she'd kept it for 7 years since her discharge, a faded piece of fabric from a uniform that didn't fit anymore but never really had to. She'd worn it under her scrubs every single shift at Sacred Heart, a reminder of who she actually was, which meant she had to make one more choice right now: sit at this bus stop until the rain washed everything away, or stand up and wait for it, because something was coming. She could feel it in the same way she used to feel incoming mortars, a pressure change, a disturbance in the air, the certainty of arrival. And then she heard it. Distant at first, almost lost in the percussion of the rain, but growing louder, a sound she hadn't heard in 7 years that was unmistakable once you'd lived it, the rhythmic thud of helicopter rotors cutting through the Colorado Springs sky, the kind of sound that made the air itself vibrate like it was holding its breath. The bus pulled up beside her. The doors hissed open. But Laura didn't move. She just sat there with her cardboard box and her dying plant and her photograph, watching the rain, listening to the rotor wash growing closer, knowing that everything was about to change again and this time there was nowhere to run. The helicopter settled on the roof helipad at 0247 hours, and the ICU erupted with controlled chaos. 3 minutes later, the doors burst open. Colonel James Vickers was crashing again, this time septic shock, his core temperature spiking to 104.7 degrees, his blood pressure collapsing like a failed structure. The residents scattered. The on-call infectious disease specialist was stuck in traffic. Dr. Mercer stood at the foot of the bed, hands in his pockets, watching the monitors with the detached gaze of a man who had already decided the outcome. Laura was not supposed to be there. She had cleared her locker 47 minutes ago. She had turned in her badge. She had stood in the rain with a dying succulent and a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," and the only reason she had come back inside was to use the restroom before walking to the bus stop. One of the ICU nurses saw her in the corridor and called her name like a question, like maybe everything that had happened in the last hour had been a bad dream. She looked through the window at Vickers. His eyes were open but unfocused. His skin had taken on that peculiar greyish pallor of cascading organ failure. The sepsis was moving like a predator through his bloodstream, and nobody in that room understood that Laura had already mapped the trajectory, fluid resuscitation protocols, vasopressor selection, the exact combination of antibiotics needed before the culture results came back. She knew it the way some people knew music. The way her hands knew battlefield medicine at 0300 hours in a dust storm outside Marjah with 3 Marines screaming and 60 seconds until the evac bird touched down. The ICU nurse, Jennifer, dark hair, exhausted eyes, looked directly at her. "He's your patient, isn't he?" Laura did not answer. She pushed through the door. The monitors shrieked their warnings. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, already working at the edge of what human lungs could endure. Dr. Mercer's head snapped up. His expression shifted, surprise, then something darker. Calculation. The room went absolutely silent. All the residents stopped moving. One of them still had their hands on the 4-pump, frozen mid-adjustment. "You were terminated," Mercer said quietly. "Not a question." "I can help him," Laura said. "You can't be here." His voice had taken on that public relations tone, measured, reasonable, the voice of a man certain of his rightness. "This is a hostile work environment situation now. I've called security." She moved to Vickers's bedside anyway. Her hands reached for the fluid administration set with the muscle memory of someone who had once kept 18 wounded operators alive during a 3-hour evacuation, and something in that motion, the fluid precision, the absence of hesitation, made the resident step backward. "Get her out of here," Mercer commanded. He was not looking at security personnel. He was not looking at anyone in particular. He was looking at the problem in front of him, and the problem was that she was saving the patient he had already given up on. Vickers's eyes focused. He saw her clearly for the first time. His lips moved, and what came out was barely a whisper, "Valkyrie." The Norse call sign. The designation that had followed her through 3 tours, through 17 ambushes, through the night they lost Tucker and Graves outside forward operating base Shank. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. One of the residents, a young man, maybe 28, with Lieutenant bars tattooed on his collarbone, stepped forward. "That's not possible," he whispered. There's no way." Laura did not break her focus from Vickers. She worked. Lactated ringers through the central line. Norepinephrine pushed to maintain mean arterial pressure at 65. A bolus of broad-spectrum antibiotics while they waited for the cultures. Her voice came out steady and low. "He needs continuous monitoring. IUPD protocol. Core temperature management. The sepsis has already hit the lungs." The door opened. A Marine in dress blues entered, Colonel David Halloway, the same rank as Vickers, the same bearing, the same presence that made the air pressure in the room change. He held a shadow box beneath one arm. Behind him came a 2-star general. Behind them came the kind of silence that happens when power shifts so fundamentally that the people in the room can feel it like a change in barometric pressure. Halloway's eyes moved across the monitors, across Vickers's stabilizing vitals, and settled on Laura. She was wearing scrubs that were no longer hers. Her name badge had been surrendered. But her hands were still moving with the precision of someone who had performed emergency surgery in the dark with nothing but a headlamp and a triage knife. "I was told this man had been abandoned by his medical team," Halloway said. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, dangerous only if you made him move. "I was told that his condition was terminal. That he was beyond intervention." He opened the shadow box. Inside, against red velvet, lay a silver star and 2 purple hearts. Bronze ribbons. The medals of someone who had seen the worst and survived anyway. "This is my medic," Halloway continued. Staff Sergeant Laura Bennett, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to Special Forces Task Force Orange. She outranks everyone in this building. And she's going to save Colonel Vickers's life. It was not a request. It was a command. Dr. Mercer's face had drained of color, not fear, but the specific shade of a man watching the institutional authority he had spent years accumulating dissolve like sugar in rain. He opened his mouth. Closed it. His eyes moved between the general, the medals, and Laura, and something in that calculation broke. He lunged toward the medication cabinet, not to help, but to document, to create a record that would contradict what everyone had just witnessed. His hand shook as he pulled open the drawers. "What are you doing?" the general asked quietly. "Documenting the illegality of this situation," Mercer said. His voice had changed. It had become high-pitched, rapid, the voice of someone whose worldview was collapsing in real time. "She has no credentials. No authorization. This is malpractice. This is criminal negligence. I will sue this hospital. I will destroy her. I will." Dr. Mercer, the general said, and something in the way he said the name made it clear this was not the first time he had said it today. The door opened again. 2 FBI agents. One held credentials. One held handcuffs. "Dr. Nathan Mercer, we have a federal warrant for your arrest regarding systematic fraud." Mercer's hand went to the medication cabinet again, this time moving faster, more erratically. He was searching for something, and Laura understood in that moment that he was trying to create new evidence, altered records, falsified documentation, anything that would support his narrative. His fingers were shaking so badly that he dropped a syringe. It clattered on the tile floor. "That's not going to work," the FBI agent said flatly. "We have your laptop. We have your email. We have 5 years of altered patient records documenting your systematic termination of staff members who challenged you. Nurses. Residents. One respiratory therapist. You fabricated complaints. You forged reviews. You created false documentation justifying dismissals. That's federal fraud, Dr. Mercer. That's conspiracy." The handcuffs clicked into place. The sound was louder than it should have been. Mercer's composure, which had been built brick by brick through humiliation and assertion of authority, shattered. He began to scream. Not words, just sound, raw and primal, the vocalization of someone watching their entire identity collapse. He thrashed against the agents holding his arms. Spittle flew from his mouth. One of the younger residents looked away, embarrassed to witness an attending at such a moment of absolute degradation. "You don't understand," Mercer was shouting. "She's nothing. She's a janitor. She's a liability. I was protecting this institution." "By firing 7 nurses on false pretenses?" the agent asked. "By destroying their careers? By creating documentation that could have killed patients?" The agents moved him toward the door. His feet dragged. He continued screaming, his voice bouncing off the ICU walls, ricocheting through the corridors, reaching the nurses' station where Jennifer stood with her hands over her mouth. Reaching the break room where 2 other nurses who had been terminated on Mercer's manufactured complaints were watching monitors. Reaching the place where Laura had once stood alone, accepting insults in silence, her jaw tight but her composure perfect, her hand steady even as her world collapsed. Now his world was collapsing. Now his screams filled the hospital. Now everyone watched. The perp walk down the corridor took 45 seconds. Laura saw it through the ICU window. She saw the nurses' faces, shock, vindication, the kind of relief that comes when institutional injustice finally encounters accountability. She saw Mercer's dress shoes dragging against the polished floor. She saw the agents, one on each arm, professional and implacable, moving him toward the exit like pallbearers. She turned back to Vickers. His oxygen saturation was climbing. 92%. 95%. The vasopressor was holding his mean arterial pressure at 68. The sepsis was aggressive, but his core temperature was beginning to respond to the cooling protocol. 12 hours from now, this man would still be alive because she had refused to run. 6 months later, Sacred Heart appointed her director of trauma operations. The hospital board made the announcement in a ceremony attended by half the staff, the nurses she had worked alongside, the residents she had trained, the administrators who had suddenly discovered that competence was more valuable than hierarchy. They offered her an office with a window overlooking Colorado Springs. They offered her administrative authority, a 6-figure salary, the kind of prestige that Mercer had wielded like a weapon. She accepted the position and kept working the night shift in the ICU. "You could run an entire department now," Jennifer said to her one evening, confusion written across her face. "I am running a department," Laura said simply. "I'm running it from inside. That's where the work is." The faded unit patch, the one that had survived 3 deployments, had been sewn into the lining of her old jacket by a seamstress outside Camp Lejeune, had stayed hidden under scrubs and self-imposed exile, now lived inside the pocket of her white coat. She touched it sometimes before rounds. Not for luck. For continuity. For the reminder that some battles are not won through authority or recognition. Some are won by showing up, by doing the work, by simply refusing to run when everyone else scattered. Dr. Mercer, meanwhile, was working insurance physicals at a strip mall urgent care off Highway 24, in a facility wedged between a nail salon and a tax preparation office. The name tag on his coat read Nathan M. He had been advised by his legal counsel not to use the title doctor in any professional capacity pending the outcome of his federal trial. His hands trembled now when he performed routine vitals. His voice had taken on a permanently uncertain quality. One afternoon, a nurse from Sacred Heart came in for her required annual physical. She recognized him. He recognized her. She had been one of the ones he had terminated, one of the ones he had accused of incompetence, one of the ones whose career he had nearly destroyed. She did not say anything. She simply looked at him. And in that look was everything, that she knew what he had tried to do, that she understood that he had failed, that his entire identity had been reduced to Nathan M., strip mall urgent care, insurance physicals. He had to excuse himself. He came back 5 minutes later with red-rimmed eyes and shaking hands. Laura walked through the trauma department at Sacred Heart one Tuesday morning, checking on patients, consulting with residents, listening to the nurses' concerns the way she had once been listened to, with genuine attention, with the understanding that the people in the trenches knew things that administrators did not. One of her nurses, a young woman named Casey, quiet and meticulous, reminded her of herself, stopped her in the corridor. "I wanted to thank you," Casey said carefully, "for creating space for us to speak. For listening when," she paused. "For not pretending that people on the front lines don't know what they're doing." Laura nodded. It was a small gesture, but it contained everything she had rebuilt her life around. The trembling wasn't fear anymore. It was something else, the muscle memory of restraint, the knowledge that true power came not from assertion but from competence, from presence, from the absolute refusal to compromise on what was right even when the entire system told you that you should. The radio crackled at 09 for 7 hours. Multi-casualty incident. 7-vehicle collision on I-25 North. 23 patients incoming. Laura's voice came through the intercom, steady and commanding. Activate code red. Get trauma A, B, and C ready. I want the entire surgical team standing by. This is my building now, and we're going to save every single person we can. The trembling had never been fear. It had been restraint, the training that taught her to hold power until the moment she needed to release it. That moment had arrived. And the young residents and nurses watching her move through the corridors with the focused intensity of a general preparing for battle understood, in that moment, that they were no longer working for a hierarchy. They were working for someone who had once pulled 3 wounded Marines out of an ambush with nothing but a rifle and a commitment to leaving no one behind. Do not pick a fight with someone who has nothing left to lose. Subscribe to hear more stories of heroes who walk among us, hidden in plain sight, carrying the weight of secrets and the strength of discipline. What would you have done in Laura's position? Would you have walked away, or would you have stepped back in? Tell us in the comments below.